In today's gospel, we have the parable of the vineyard and the tenants. This is probably the most misunderstood and misused of the parables, because obviously Jesus is talking about God as being the owner and the prophets as servants and himself as the son. But often the tenants are understood to be the Jewish people, and this parable is used to justify a doctrine of supersessionism, an implicit, if not explicit, anti-Semitism. That is, it is understood to mean the Jewish people were God's chosen people, but they ignored, persecuted, and even killed the prophets and ultimately Jesus as well. And as a result, God gave up on them, and Christians became God's new chosen people. And because they ceased to be God's chosen people, and they forced the Romans to execute Jesus, the Jewish people should be forced to convert or be imprisoned, tortured, and possibly executed. This is not what the scriptures say. This is not what Matthew meant, and this is certainly not what Jesus meant. Never should the scriptures be used to justify anti-Semitism. The writers of the scriptures may not have been part of mainstream Judaism, but even the writers of the Christian scriptures would have identified as Jewish. And as we read in our second reading today, Paul, the most prolific of the writers of the Christian scriptures, identified as extremely Jewish, with all the credentials he could possibly earn. Jewish people were, are, and will always be God's chosen people with whom God has a special relationship. At best, the rest of us can hope to be adopted into that relationship through our faith and actions. So if Jesus was not talking about the Jewish people and preaching a supersessionist theology, what is today's gospel about? Well, it is clear. Jesus was talking about the chief priests and the Pharisees. He was talking about the religious and political leaders who were using their positions for their own advantages and not for the building of God's kingdom. It was the people who had been entrusted with taking care of God's creation, including the people in it who were not fulfilling their obligations, and for this, they would be punished. When those of us entrusted with power use that power for personal gain, rather than to build God's kingdom on earth, we drive people away from God. So what model of leadership should we look to instead? Well, I think we need to look to the life of one of the most famous of the Christian saints, a man whose feast day was marked this past Wednesday, St. Francis of Assisi. Francis was a second or third son of an Italian cloth merchant and a French noblewoman. He was not the first son and set to inherit everything, but he was set to inherit a lot. And if he kept up the family business, he could have lived a life of ease, and he could have even been a hanger-on to his brother's house, the partying black sheep the wealthy and powerful families always seem to have. And that was a role he seemed to be setting himself up for in his early years. But then something changed, and Francis gave it all away to become a new kind of leader, one who rejected the power of being the leader, and instead took on the role of being the ultimate servant. He chose to live as a beggar, starting each day with nothing, free from all obligations to other wealthy and powerful families and individuals. He did eventually concede the need to own some property in common to ensure safety, but he rejected comfort and fashion, instead choosing to serve and bring God's message to the poorest and most disenfranchised by becoming one with them. And because he had rejected creature comforts, he also brought himself into closer contact with the natural world. Through this, Francis was able to see the interdependence between the natural world and humanity, and to see creation as something to be treasured, not exploited. And while I am not going to abandon my children, husband, and home and follow Francis's example, I do recognize the need to always stay humble and seek to serve rather than control, and to recognize the interconnectedness of all creation, both as a priest and in my secular career. And that is what the gospel today is asking anyone who has been entrusted with leadership, including within our own families as parents and grandparents, to do. To be the model that welcomes others in and does not exploit one's role for personal advantage. To listen to Jesus and the prophets, to be the good stewards of the kingdom. Amen.